The hilltop funeral. The small hill on the outskirts of the ranch seemed to hold its breath as the funeral ceremony unfolded beneath an overcast sky. The world seemed suspended in time, the muted gray clouds heavy with sorrow. The ranch, once teeming with the life of animals, crops, and hard-working hands, now stood quiet, its fields empty, its barns untouched. The towering oak trees, which had once shaded the farm workers in the heat of summer, stood like silent witnesses to the tragedy that had befallen them all. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something more, a certain heaviness, as if the land itself mourned the loss of its master. In a small clearing at the top of the hill, the gathering of mourners formed a loose circle around a freshly dug grave. The hole in the earth, the dirt piled to the side, seemed too large for the man it had swallowed. Sean's life had been much bigger than the space he now occupied. He was the man who had built a legacy from the soil, who had offered a hand to those struggling to survive in a world that seemed intent on crushing them underfoot. And yet, at just 48 years old, his life had been snuffed out like a candle in the wind, leaving behind only sorrow, confusion, and bitter accusations. Haley, Sean's wife, stood rigidly at the edge of the grave. Her eyes were swollen, red from hours of crying, her makeup smudged from the constant tears. She clutched a handkerchief tightly, but it did little to stifle her sobs. Her grief was overwhelming, yes, but underneath it lay something darker, something that had been growing inside her for days, weeks, even months. Anger, simmering with every breath she took. It was a fury that was impossible to extinguish, for it had taken root in her heart the moment she had lost Sean. He was a good man, she choked out between sobs, her voice cracking like fragile glass. The words seemed to escape her lips automatically, as though the grief demanded them. But they didn't have the same reverence they once might have. Now, they felt empty, hollow, an echo in the wind that didn't quite match the truth she was now so desperately clinging to. He was too good for this world, Haley continued, the bitterness creeping into her tone. Her hands gripped the sides of her dress as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. He spent his entire life helping them, those greedy blacks. The word blacks dripped from her lips like venom, so full of disgust that the words seemed to hang in the air like an accusation, a verdict. The mourners around her shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their heads, others glancing at one another. But no one dared to speak up. They had seen Haley's grief, they had heard the rumors, but no one wanted to challenge the widow at this moment. Even in the face of such raw, uncontrolled emotion, there was a sense of dread in the air, a shared unease, like a storm that could not be avoided. Sean gave them everything, jobs, a place to stay, food to eat. Haley's voice grew stronger with each word, each accusation. And they repaid him with betrayal. They tried to steal from him. I caught them, I saw them trying to take what wasn't theirs. And when we caught them, when we confronted them, they set the place on fire. They burned down everything we had built together. Her voice was now rising in pitch, shaking with the weight of her anger and grief. The sound of her cries echoed through the hills, carrying on the wind as if the land itself was reacting to her fury. She wiped her eyes again, smearing the remnants of her mascara as she continued her tirade. Sean fought to the end. He sacrificed himself to save me, to get me out of that fire. He was the last one out. And both of them, Margaret and Myra, they died in the flames. She stopped for a moment, sucking in a deep breath, as though the weight of her emotions was finally breaking through the dam she had tried so hard to hold back. Sean was too good for this world. He doesn't deserve this. He'll go to heaven, but those black devils, will burn in hell for what they've done. The words were a final lash of anger, and they echoed off the hillsides like a curse. The crowd fell silent, the murmurs that had been spreading like ripples across the mourners suddenly ceasing as if all the air had been sucked out of the clearing. Haley stood, her body shaking from the intensity of her outburst, her fists clenched at her sides as though she were ready to strike out at anyone who dared to speak against her. The sun, hidden behind the clouds, seemed to hide itself from her rage, leaving the gathering in the half-light of the overcast day. It was then that the small figure appeared at the edge of the gathering, stepping into the circle of mourners as if she had always belonged there. Myra, the daughter of Margaret, stood alone, clutching a small bundle of wildflowers in her tiny hands. She was no older than 10, her eyes wide with confusion and fear, but there was something in her gaze that was steady, resolute, as though she had made a decision long before arriving at this moment. The gasps rippled through the crowd as they noticed the girl standing at the edge of the mourners. Haley's eyes locked on her almost immediately, and her rage flared up once again. "How dare you," she shrieked, her voice shrill with fury. "How dare you come here? You and your mother killed my husband. Your family. I don't want you here." She took a step forward, her hands shaking, fists clenched at her sides. "Someone call the police. This little criminal doesn't belong here." The crowd was shocked into silence, eyes darting from Haley to Myra, unsure of how to react. This was not how a funeral was supposed to unfold. This was not what anyone had expected. But Myra stood her ground, her tiny form trembling but unwavering, her expression one of quiet determination. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence here, her simple, silent existence, spoke volumes. Her small shoulders squared as she took a step forward, closing the distance between herself and the angry widow. Haley, with her tears and accusations, seemed to freeze in place for a moment, as if unsure how to proceed. The tension was unbearable, thick with grief, anger, and something more, something neither Haley nor Myra could yet fully understand. The whispers grew louder. "That's Myra, the daughter of Margaret. The girl who was with her mother when the fire started. What was Myra doing here? Why had she come to the funeral of the man who had died in the flames, the man who had once employed her mother, the man who had been the reason for so much suffering in their lives? And more importantly, what had really happened that night?" Myra stood silently, her eyes fixed on Haley, her wildflowers clutched tightly to her chest. She didn't answer the questions, she didn't try to explain. There was no need for words, not yet. There was a bigger truth, a deeper story that had been buried beneath the fire and the ashes. And Myra was about to unearth it. The funeral had begun as an occasion for mourning, but it was about to become a moment of reckoning, where the truth of what happened would finally be revealed, and nothing would ever be the same again. Beneath the surface, Sean's reputation in the region was one of generosity and community spirit, and it had been long established. His ranch, nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and thick forests, wasn't just a place of work, it was a sanctuary for many. The fruit farm he had established had begun as a modest enterprise but had grown into something much greater, a symbol of hope in an otherwise difficult land. People knew Sean as the man who offered second chances, who never turned a hungry family away, who always had a job for those in need. His kindness had no boundaries, and in a place where many were struggling to make ends meet, Sean's farm provided stability, food, and employment. Sean had inherited the farm from his father, who had been a strict, conservative man with very little tolerance for outsiders. The farm had been hard work, demanding endless hours of labor, and it was understood that the land was meant to be worked by those who shared his bloodline. But when Sean took over the farm, he made a radical decision. He rejected his father's narrow view of the world and welcomed anyone who was willing to work hard, regardless of their background or race. He believed in people, not just profits. Margaret and her daughter, Myra, had been among the first to benefit from Sean's open arms. Margaret had come to Sean's ranch years ago, after her husband had passed in an accident, leaving her to raise Myra alone. She had come from a long line of farm workers, and though her skin was dark, she was no stranger to hard work. It didn't take long for her to prove herself capable, and Sean, recognizing her dedication, had offered her a place on his land. Soon after, Margaret's daughter, Myra, was brought into the fold, helping with the chores that only a child could manage, fetching water from the well, picking the berries, gathering firewood. Over time, Myra grew into a strong and capable young woman, and as she grew older, she took on more responsibilities, learning how to tend the orchard and manage the livestock. In many ways, the farm had become her second home. As years passed, Sean's generosity didn't falter. He offered more than just jobs, he gave families a place to live. The workers, many of them black, were allowed to build small homes on the property, modest but safe places to stay as they worked. For the first time, many of the families had security. They were no longer forced to wander from farm to farm, struggling to find work. Instead, they had a permanent place to stay, surrounded by a community that cared for them. Sean's generosity was not without consequences, however. His views and actions didn't sit well with everyone. While many appreciated his approach, others resented it. Some of the neighboring ranchers, particularly those from old, established families with more traditional values, viewed Sean as a threat. They saw him as a radical, a man who was eroding the social order. To them, his behavior was an affront to the way things had always been done. They believed that work should be reserved for the hard-working, the ones who had earned their place, and not for the unworthy, who were only there to take advantage. Among those who resented Sean were people in his own circle, those who worked alongside him on the farm. They saw his kindness as a weakness. They were the ones who had known his father, and they had been raised in an environment that valued hard work and discipline, not the charity Sean so freely offered. It was these people who began to whisper in the shadows about the true cost of Sean's generosity. Some said he was being too soft, too naive, while others suggested he was allowing criminals into his midst. Rumors began to spread about thefts, missing items, and suspicions that some of Sean's workers were not as honest as they appeared. The whispers grew louder, and suspicion began to stain the image of Sean's kindness. But despite all the gossip and resentment, Sean stood firm. He never wavered from his belief that everyone deserved a fair chance, even if it meant risking his own fortune. He had long made peace with the fact that some people would misunderstand him, that some would take advantage of his generosity. In his heart, he knew that the good he was doing would outweigh the harm, that the blessings he gave would return to him tenfold. Yet, as with all stories of generosity, there was a breaking point. Margaret had been a trusted member of Sean's team for many years. She had worked tirelessly, building a life for herself and her daughter on the farm. But over the last year, something had changed in her. She had become more distant, more tense. Myra had noticed it first. Her mother was no longer the warm, gentle woman she used to be. She was often angry, speaking in harsh tones and becoming easily irritated. Myra didn't know what had caused the change. At first, she thought it was just the pressure of working long hours in the heat, or the strain of keeping up with the demands of running the farm. But as time went on, Myra began to sense that something darker was at play. Margaret had always been proud of the life Sean had given them, but now, her pride seemed to turn into bitterness. It was as if the life they had built together no longer satisfied her. She started questioning Sean's generosity, his treatment of the workers. The whispers she had heard about the thefts and the people who had been taking advantage of him seemed to feed her growing resentment. She began to speak more often about how Sean's kindness had been foolish. She told Myra that they would never truly be a part of Sean's world, no matter how much they worked, no matter how much they contributed. There were always those who looked down on them, who saw them as less than. At first, Myra had tried to brush it off. She couldn't understand her mother's frustration. But as the months passed, the tension became unbearable. Margaret's resentment started to take root in Myra, and she began to see the world around her with a different lens, one that was colored by anger and distrust. And in the silence of their shared struggles, Margaret confided in Myra something that would change everything. Margaret told Myra that the ranch was a losing battle. That Sean's farm was sinking into debt, that he was losing control, and that they were all at risk of losing everything. She spoke about how they had been given a chance, but how much longer could they stay? How much longer could they live on the charity of a man who had overextended himself, giving so much of what he had to others? She whispered of a future where they could take what they were owed, where they could finally get out from under Sean's shadow and claim something for themselves. It was then that Myra began to notice strange things happening around the ranch. Items went missing. Equipment was found in places it shouldn't have been. There was a feeling in the air, a creeping sense of unease that began to grow. The day of the fire would come soon after. This extended version of Part 2 explores more of Sean's legacy, the dynamics on the ranch, and how the growing tensions within the family slowly began to seep into the foundation of the farm. It also deepens the relationship between Margaret and Myra, as well as hinting at the cracks that would eventually lead to the fateful night of the fire. It gives a broader context to Sean's kindness, providing insights into the challenges he faced in his efforts to help those in need. Certainly. Here is an extended and detailed version of Part 3 that delves deeper into the fire, its build-up, and the tragic events surrounding it, with new elements added to further develop the plot and characters. The fire that changed everything. The evening air that summer night was unusually still, carrying with it a sense of foreboding that seemed to wrap around the ranch. The sun had set behind the distant hills, leaving the sky bathed in hues of pink and orange that slowly faded into deep purple. The quiet hum of cicadas filled the air, but beneath their song, there was something more, an uneasy silence that seemed to settle heavily over the farm. It was as if the land itself was waiting for something, anticipating an event that would change everything. Sean had spent the better part of the day overseeing repairs on the farmhouse. The windmill was broken again, a constant issue that had been plaguing the farm for weeks. His mind was occupied, consumed by the thought of the farm's future. Despite his unwavering generosity, Sean could feel the pressure mounting. The debts were piling up, and the farm was struggling to keep up with its growing expenses. Yet, even as the weight of it all pressed down on him, he refused to show weakness. He refused to turn his back on the people who relied on him. The workers were all home for the evening, finishing up their chores, and the farm had fallen into a quiet routine. But not all was peaceful on the ranch. The air was thick with tension, particularly between Margaret and Sean. The last few weeks had been marked by awkward silences, heated arguments, and strange glances exchanged when neither could hold the weight of unspoken words any longer. Margaret had become distant, cold even, and Sean had noticed the change in her. Something was off, something that neither he nor Myra could explain. But it wasn't just her. The workers seemed to sense it too. The mood at the farm had shifted, a subtle shift that nobody could quite name, but everyone could feel. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Margaret had spoken to Myra in hushed tones. Their conversation had been brief but heavy with meaning. Margaret spoke of how Sean's kindness was a double-edged sword. She spoke of how he had given and given, but the more he gave, the more the farm seemed to slip away from his grasp. Margaret's frustration, her bitter resentment, had grown over the past few months, and that evening, it had reached a boiling point. "I've been thinking," Margaret had whispered to Myra as they sat on the porch, looking out at the darkening fields. "This can't go on forever. We're giving too much, and we're getting nothing in return." Myra had been quiet, staring down at her hands. She had tried to ignore the growing bitterness in her mother's voice, tried to dismiss the dark thoughts that seemed to be taking root in her. But she couldn't ignore the truth of it. The farm was struggling. Sean's generosity, while admirable, had come at a cost. The land was no longer as prosperous as it once had been, and the workers had begun to feel the pressure of mounting debts. Margaret continued, her voice low but steady. "Sean is blinded by his own ideals. He doesn't see that we're drowning. It's only a matter of time before it all falls apart." Myra had tried to stop her, tried to tell her mother that Sean would find a way. But Margaret wouldn't hear it. "You don't understand," she snapped, her voice rising for the first time. He's too soft. He's too kind. And now it's going to destroy everything. That night, as the stars began to appear in the sky, a sense of urgency had settled over Margaret. She moved quickly, purposefully, as if the weight of her decision had finally come to fruition. Myra had watched her mother with growing concern, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Margaret's words from earlier that night kept echoing in Myra's mind, "It's only a matter of time before it all falls apart." The fire started not long after midnight. No one knew exactly how it began, but it spread with terrifying speed, igniting the dry brush near the back of the property. The wind, which had been still earlier in the evening, picked up suddenly, fueling the flames and pushing them toward the barns. It was an inferno before anyone even realized what was happening. The firestorm swept through the fields in minutes, devouring everything in its path, trees, crops, and buildings, all reduced to cinders. The flames stretched toward the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the ranch. The smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating. It was as though the ranch was being consumed alive, the land itself burning in response to something that had been deeply broken beneath its surface. Sean had been in the farmhouse when the fire began. He was still working on repairs, trying to fix what he could before the next harvest. The windmill was his last concern for the evening, but it would be the fire that stole everything from him. He had heard the crackling of the flames at first, like a distant thunder. He had rushed to the window and seen the orange glow in the distance. His heart sank, and without hesitation, he ran outside, shouting for the workers to gather their families and get to safety. Sean had always been a man of action, but the fire moved too quickly. It was everywhere, its heat oppressive, its sound deafening. He ordered everyone to evacuate, but not everyone had gotten out in time. The fire spread to the houses where the workers lived, trapping them inside. It was chaos. The smoke was thick, and the heat was unbearable. There was no way to escape the inferno that had taken over everything. Margaret had been one of the last to leave. She had run toward the barn, but the flames had already surrounded it. She had tried to run back toward the farmhouse, but by the time she reached the front, the fire had completely overtaken the land. Myra was by her side, her face pale with fear as she tried to follow her mother's every step. "Myra, we have to go. We have to go." Margaret screamed, but Myra couldn't keep up. The flames were closing in on them, and every moment felt like it could be their last. In the midst of the madness, Sean had tried to help. He ran through the thick smoke, searching for anyone he could find. He found Margaret in the distance, her figure silhouetted against the flames, struggling to escape. His heart stopped when he saw her. He knew what he had to do. With one last glance at Myra, who was being pulled to safety by the other workers, Sean raced toward the fire to save Margaret. It was a sacrifice he knew he had to make. By the time the fire was extinguished, both Sean and Margaret had perished in the blaze. The workers found Myra, terrified but alive, her clothes singed and her body covered in soot, but there were no words left to explain the horror that had unfolded. Everything had changed in the span of a few hours, and with it, the secrets of the night would remain locked away beneath the ashes. The morning after the fire, the ranch was unrecognizable. The fields, once vibrant with crops, were now blackened, charred remnants. The barns were gone, reduced to rubble. The farmhouse stood like a hollow shell, its windows shattered, its doors scorched beyond recognition. The fire had claimed it all, the livelihood of the workers, the home they had built, and, most tragically, the lives of the two people who had made it all possible. Haley, when she arrived at the scene, found only the aftermath. The shock of losing her husband was unbearable, but there was something else, a sense of betrayal and confusion. She couldn't understand why Sean had sacrificed himself for Margaret. Why hadn't he run? Why hadn't he left the fire to claim everything it would? There were so many unanswered questions, so many things that didn't add up. And as she stood among the ruins, the truth, twisted and incomplete, began to form in her mind. Haley's grief and anger. The days following the fire passed in a blur for Haley. The pain of losing Sean, her partner of 20 years, seemed unbearable, a heavy weight that crushed her chest with every breath. She found it hard to focus on anything, her mind constantly returning to that night, the heat of the flames, the chaos of the evacuation, the desperate search for Sean in the smoke and burning debris. But no matter how many times she relived those moments in her head, there was one question that refused to leave her: why had he sacrificed himself for Margaret? Haley couldn't understand it. Of all the people Sean had helped over the years, why had he chosen to run into the fire to save someone who had, according to Haley's account, betrayed him? The fact that Margaret and Myra had been involved in the thefts, the things Haley had heard whispered around the ranch, the rumors of dishonest behavior, seemed to be ignored in the wake of Sean's final act. She had been there when the fire started, not far from the farmhouses, and she had seen Sean's efforts to save others. But now, with him gone, Haley was left to sift through the wreckage of her life. The ranch, their life's work, was in ruins. The workers were scattered, uncertain about their future, and the debts that Sean had accumulated were now hers to deal with. Yet, it wasn't just the financial mess that haunted Haley, it was the deep, gnawing feeling of betrayal. Margaret and Myra had destroyed the life they had worked so hard to build. In Haley's mind, they had betrayed the very foundation of everything Sean stood for. And now, Myra, that little girl, had the audacity to show up at Sean's funeral. Haley could hardly contain her anger when she saw Myra standing there, clutching a bundle of wildflowers. It was as if the girl was mocking her, mocking everything Sean had given her family, only to have it all turn to ash. Haley had expected grief at the funeral. She had expected respect, even fear, but what she had not expected was Myra's presence. The sight of the little girl, the daughter of the woman who had been one of the last to flee the fire, who had been directly involved in the disaster, brought something darker out in Haley. It wasn't just grief anymore, it was rage. She couldn't let go of the idea that Myra, despite everything, was still standing there. How could she, a child, be so indifferent to the destruction her mother had caused? "Someone call the police," Haley had shouted in the midst of the chaos at the funeral. "This little criminal doesn't belong here. She's just like her mother, her family betrayed us, and now she's here to rub it in." Her words had cut through the crowd, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze around her. Haley felt her hands tremble, but she couldn't stop herself. The anger coursed through her veins, sharp and hot. It was the only thing she could hold on to now. But Myra's silence in that moment had unsettled her. The little girl didn't protest or run away. She simply stood there, clutching her flowers, her eyes locked onto Haley's with an intensity that Haley could neither comprehend nor ignore. The expression on Myra's face was not one of guilt or fear, it was calm, almost serene, as though the girl was certain of something that Haley was too blinded by her rage to see. In the days that followed, Haley found herself obsessing over Myra's presence. She couldn't shake the image of the girl standing at the edge of the grave, unafraid of the storm Haley had unleashed. Myra was a child, how could she not fear Haley's wrath? But instead of fear, the girl had seemed resolute, unmoving in the face of Haley's accusations. It didn't make sense to Haley, and she couldn't stop thinking about it. The more she thought, the more she wondered if Myra knew something that no one else did. Haley's grief became entwined with her suspicion. She began to ask herself questions she hadn't wanted to entertain before. What if Myra had been involved in the fire? What if her mother's betrayal hadn't been the whole truth? The more she dug into the past, the more she uncovered, and the more questions arose. But the answers she found were often conflicting and unsatisfying. She visited the remnants of the ranch in the days after the fire, walking through the charred remains of the farmhouse, the barns, and the fields. The devastation was overwhelming. There was no longer any trace of the farm that had once been alive with activity, no trace of the community Sean had worked so hard to build. It was all gone now. The buildings were reduced to rubble, and the once vibrant crops had been reduced to ash. Haley's heart broke each time she walked through the ruins, each piece of the wreckage reminding her of what she had lost, of what they had both worked for, and most of all, of what had been taken from them by Margaret and Myra. In the quiet moments, when the workers were busy cleaning up or rebuilding, Haley would stand alone in the silence of the ashes. She thought about Sean's last moments, about the sacrifice he had made for Margaret, and about how she would never understand why. But there was a deeper, more pressing question gnawing at her. What if the fire hadn't been an accident? What if Margaret and Myra had set it on purpose? What if they had betrayed Sean's kindness, not out of desperation, but out of a darker, more calculated need for revenge? The whispers around the community had always been there, those who had suspected the fire was no accident, those who had wondered if something more sinister was at play. But Haley had refused to believe it. She had been too focused on her grief, on her loss, to consider the possibility that Margaret and Myra might have been involved in something far more malicious than a simple act of betrayal. But now, standing amidst the remnants of the farm, the question seemed impossible to ignore. And if Myra had known more, if she had been hiding something about that night, Haley had to find out. She could no longer stand by and accept the story that had been handed to her, a story of victimhood and loss. Haley needed the truth, no matter how painful it would be. Haley began to investigate, her eyes now focused on uncovering what had really happened during the fire. She reached out to the few workers who had remained on the ranch after the fire, people who had been on the ground that night. One by one, they spoke of strange things they had noticed, things that hadn't seemed important at the time but now seemed like red flags. One worker, an older man named Jeb, spoke of hearing strange noises near the barn before the fire started, noises that he had initially dismissed as the wind or the animals. But in hindsight, he realized they might have been footsteps, muffled and hurried. Another worker, a young woman named Clara, told Haley that she had seen Margaret and Myra near the barn shortly before the fire had broken out, but they had been acting strangely. They had been speaking in hushed tones, moving quickly, as though they were trying to avoid being seen. When Clara had tried to approach them, they had quickly disappeared into the night. Haley felt her heart race as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The more she listened, the more she began to wonder if she had been wrong all along. Was the story she had been told, a story of betrayal, a story of a mother and daughter trying to steal from Sean, truly the whole truth? Or had something much darker been at play that night? The suspicion that had begun as a flicker in her mind now burned brightly, and Haley knew that she would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. Myra, with her calm, unwavering presence at the funeral, was at the center of it all. Haley couldn't ignore her any longer. The girl, now alone in the world, was somehow tied to the destruction of everything Sean had worked for. As the sun set over the remains of the ranch, Haley stood alone among the ashes, her heart heavy with both grief and a growing resolve. She had lost everything, but she would not let the truth slip away. No matter how dark the answers were, she would find them. And when she did, she would make sure that the world knew what really happened. Myra's silence. Myra had never been one to speak much, even as a child. In the days after the fire, she had become even quieter, retreating into herself in a way that made those around her uneasy. It wasn't just the grief, it was something deeper, something that seemed to hang around her like a shadow, a weight that Myra carried but refused to acknowledge. Her life had been shattered in an instant, the ranch, her home, everything she had known, now nothing more than smoldering ruins. And yet, she felt strangely detached from it all. The people who had surrounded her for years, the workers, the ranch hands, the neighbors, had all disappeared, either fleeing the chaos of the fire or finding refuge in other places. Myra, in a sense, was alone. But the thing that unsettled her most was Haley. Haley's fury had been palpable, and Myra could feel it whenever she entered the room. The woman's anger had seeped into every corner of the house, every whispered conversation. It was as though Myra herself were being blamed for something she couldn't control. In her heart, Myra didn't know what had happened that night. The fire had been a storm, a violent, unpredictable force that had taken everything in its path. But what Haley didn't understand, and what Myra herself couldn't explain, was that the fire had been more than just an accident. It had been a breaking point, a culmination of things that had been building for years, both in Margaret's heart and in the hearts of others. Myra had tried to ignore the whispers, the accusations. But she couldn't. Not when Haley screamed at her during the funeral, calling her a criminal, a child of betrayal. Myra didn't argue. She didn't shout back, though every fiber of her being wanted to. Instead, she stood there in silence, clutching the wildflowers she had picked from the edge of the hill, trying to hold on to the memory of the ranch in its better days. For a brief moment, she had thought that the flowers might somehow carry her mother's spirit, or the memory of the life they had once shared. But now, standing there, hearing Haley's venomous words, Myra wasn't sure if anything could help her understand what had truly happened. It had all started so innocently. Margaret had been tired, more exhausted than usual. The months leading up to the fire had been marked by tense conversations at night, after Myra had gone to bed, when her mother thought she wasn't listening. Margaret had started to change, both in her attitude and in her demeanor. The gentle woman Myra had once known, the woman who had worked tirelessly to make sure they had a place to call home, was now someone Myra barely recognized. There was an edge to her words, a bitterness that seeped into every conversation, no matter how small. At first, Myra thought it was the pressure of running the ranch, of dealing with Sean's financial troubles. The farm had been in decline for some time. But it wasn't just about money. It was more about something deeper. Something inside Margaret had broken. The kindness Sean had shown them, his willingness to help, to trust people who had nothing, had begun to feel like a chain around Margaret's neck. She had started to talk about their place in the world, about how they were always going to be outsiders, always dependent on Sean's charity. Myra, though young, had heard the whispers of the other workers. She had overheard conversations about how generous Sean had been, but she also knew the grudging respect that some of the workers had for him, respect tinged with resentment. They weren't the first family Sean had helped, but they were one of the few who had lived on the land for so long. And as the farm's debts grew, the cracks in the family's relationship with Sean deepened. But it was the night of the fire that would change everything. Margaret had been acting strangely that evening. Myra hadn't seen her mother so agitated in a long time. She had been moving quickly around the house, muttering under her breath, her face pale and tense. When Myra had asked her what was wrong, Margaret had only shaken her head, refusing to answer. As the evening wore on, Myra had sensed the urgency in her mother's actions. There had been something frantic about the way Margaret had urged her to leave the house, to go out into the fields. "We need to get away from here, Myra," her mother had said, pulling her away from the warmth of the house and out into the cool night air. "You don't know what they're capable of." At the time, Myra hadn't understood. It was only later, after the fire had consumed everything, that she began to understand the truth of her mother's words. The fire had been an act of desperation. Margaret had known it, had somehow been a part of it. She had set it in motion, intentionally or not, and it had consumed everything. It had taken the land, the workers, and, most tragically, Sean's life. The truth was more painful than Myra could have ever imagined, but it wasn't one she could run from any longer. As Myra stood in the ashes of the ranch, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of guilt. She hadn't been able to save anyone. She hadn't been able to stop her mother, and now, her silence seemed like a betrayal of its own. She had always believed that silence was the answer. If she didn't speak, if she didn't confront what had happened, maybe she could hold on to the life they had once had. But the truth couldn't be ignored. It never could. In the days following the funeral, Myra stayed quiet, watching Haley's every move from the shadows. She couldn't bring herself to approach the woman who had once been so kind to her, but now seemed filled with nothing but hate and fury. Haley's accusations, though harsh, had a ring of truth to them. Myra knew what had happened, she had known for a long time, but she wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. But Haley's obsession with the fire, with the idea that Myra and her mother were the ones to blame, would not fade. The more she sought answers, the more she became convinced that Myra held the key to the truth. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance, she was part of the story, part of the tragedy that had destroyed everything. One evening, as Haley was walking through the remnants of the farm, she spotted Myra in the distance, sitting alone on the edge of a hill. The sight of the girl, so small against the backdrop of the devastation, filled Haley with an overwhelming sense of anger and sadness. It was Myra's presence that seemed to haunt her, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. With each step Haley took toward the girl, the air around her seemed to thicken. The weight of her emotions, her suspicions, and her grief were all bottled up inside her, ready to spill over. As she reached Myra, she stood for a moment, watching her, before speaking in a voice that was both calm and sharp. "I know what happened," Haley said, her voice carrying a deadly quiet. "You and your mother, what you did to my husband. What you did to all of us." Myra didn't respond. She didn't flinch or look away. Instead, she simply gazed out at the horizon, her expression unreadable. Haley took a step closer, her voice trembling with the weight of her accusation. "I'm not going to let you get away with it. I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. What you did. It's unforgivable." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the charred remains of the ranch. Then, very slowly, Myra turned to face Haley, her eyes steady and unflinching. She didn't speak, but there was something in her gaze that caused Haley's heart to stop for a moment. It wasn't guilt or fear. It wasn't even sorrow. It was something much deeper, something Haley couldn't quite place, but something that made her realize, for the first time, that there was more to this story than she could ever understand. The truth comes to light. The wind was unusually calm for a late summer afternoon, carrying only the faintest rustle of dying leaves across the desolate remains of the ranch. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to be revealed. The charred earth beneath Haley's boots felt heavier with each step, each moment a reminder of everything she had lost. The ruins of the farm, once a place full of life and hope, now stood as a hollow shell. And in the midst of it all, there was only one thing left to do. Haley had never been one to shy away from confrontation, but now, as she walked toward Myra, the tension in the air felt different. It was no longer fueled by rage alone. It was tinged with the desire for understanding, a hunger to know the truth that had remained hidden for so long. For days now, Haley had been searching for answers, and with each passing moment, her conviction had only grown stronger. Her mind churned with the accusations she had made, the belief that Margaret and Myra were responsible for the fire, the pain, the loss. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, a voice that had begun to question everything she had assumed. Was it possible she had been wrong? Could the fire have been something else, something she had yet to understand? Now, standing before Myra, this quiet, unyielding child, the answers were within reach. Haley could feel it in the air, the undeniable sense that the truth would soon break free from its chains. And as she took another step closer to Myra, Haley knew that everything she thought she knew was about to change forever. "Myra," Haley said, her voice low but steady. The girl turned slowly to face her, her expression calm but guarded. "You and your mother, did you start the fire?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and yet, as Haley spoke the words, they felt more like a plea. A plea for confirmation, for something that would either solidify everything she had believed or shatter it entirely. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to remain still, waiting for Myra's response. For a long time, Myra didn't say anything. She simply looked at Haley, her small hands clutching the bundle of wildflowers as though it were her lifeline, the only thing that kept her tethered to the world around her. Her silence was deafening, but it wasn't one of guilt or fear. It was something else entirely. And for the first time, Haley realized that perhaps this was not about Myra at all. It was about something much bigger, something that neither of them had fully understood. Finally, Myra spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "No, we didn't start the fire." Haley froze, her breath catching in her throat. The words felt like a punch to the gut, a revelation that shattered everything she had built her grief upon. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice rising with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What do you mean, you didn't start it?" "Your mother, she—" "My mother didn't start it," Myra interrupted, her gaze never leaving Haley's. "She didn't want it to happen. It wasn't her choice." The words were like a veil lifting, a light shining on the dark, twisted truth that had been buried beneath layers of grief and misunderstanding. Myra's eyes, filled with a mixture of sadness and defiance, seemed to pierce through Haley's anger, laying bare the depth of her pain. "You don't understand," Myra continued, her voice gaining strength. "It wasn't just about the fire. It wasn't about revenge or betrayal. It was about survival." Haley's mind reeled. Her heart, already heavy with the weight of her husband's death, felt as though it might break into 1,000 pieces. "What do you mean, survival? What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling now, no longer filled with anger, but with something far more vulnerable, doubt. Myra took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she slowly began to recount the events that had led up to that fateful night. "My mother wasn't angry at Sean," Myra said quietly, her eyes downcast, as though the truth was too painful to fully face. "She didn't hate him. But she was scared for us. The farm was falling apart. Sean's generosity, the way he kept giving and giving, it couldn't go on forever. The debts were piling up. The workers were leaving. People were starting to talk. There were rumors that the land was no longer worth anything. My mother, she knew that if we stayed, we'd lose everything." Haley's mind raced as Myra spoke, but the pieces weren't coming together. "So, you're telling me the fire was an accident?" Haley asked, disbelief in her voice. "You expect me to believe that? That it just happened? That it wasn't your fault?" "No," Myra said, shaking her head. "It wasn't an accident. But it wasn't what you think either." She paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. "That night, my mother was desperate. She knew we were about to lose everything. We were going to be turned out with nothing, and she couldn't bear the thought of us being left with nothing. So, she tried to get everything out before it was too late." "Everything?" Haley asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean by that?" Myra looked directly at her now, her eyes filled with a profound sadness that seemed far older than her years. "My mother tried to set the barn on fire. She thought it would be a way to destroy everything, destroy the farm, the land, the debts. It was supposed to be a way to make it all go away. But she didn't think it would spread. She didn't think the wind would carry it so quickly, that it would take the whole ranch with it. She didn't think Sean would be inside." Haley's breath caught in her throat, and for a long time, she said nothing. The truth had unraveled before her, a thread pulled from the fabric of her grief, and it left her feeling hollow, as though the very foundation of her understanding had crumbled away. Myra wasn't the villain in this story. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't even her mother's fault, entirely. It was a tragic mistake, one born from desperation and fear, not malice. "I don't know what happened after that," Myra whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know why my mother ran toward the flames. Maybe she thought she could stop it. Maybe she just couldn't bear to leave. But by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late." Haley stood in stunned silence, the weight of Myra's words pressing down on her chest like an unbearable burden. She had spent days, weeks, consumed by her anger, blaming Myra and her mother for the fire. And now, standing before her, the truth was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. For the first time, Haley saw Myra not as the child who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but as a victim. One who had lost everything, just as she had. Myra had lost her mother, her home, and her innocence in the flames. And in that moment, Haley realized that she, too, had been consumed by something, by grief, by rage, by the need to understand why. But understanding was never simple. It never came in a neat package with clear answers. It came in fragments, in pieces that didn't always fit together. "I'm so sorry," Haley said softly, her voice barely audible. She didn't know what else to say. The truth had destroyed her certainty, shattered the foundation of the story she had told herself. She had blamed Myra, but the truth was far more painful than anything she could have imagined. Myra looked at her, her expression still filled with sadness but with a glimmer of understanding. "I know," she whispered. "I know." For a long while, neither of them spoke. They stood there, facing the ashes of the ranch, the place where so much had been lost and yet, somehow, a new understanding had been found. The fire had claimed everything, but it had also given them a chance to see the truth. And in that truth, there was no hero or villain, only people who had been caught in the storm, trying to survive the best they knew how.